I call Stuart Nash.
Thank you very much, Mr Chair. Just a short call on this. First of all, I'd just like to point out I think a terminology is wrong here. In 39D 2B, it talks about every officer in command of every vessel, aircraft or unit of the New Zealand Defence Force, and then it talks about customs officer and fisheries officer. I'd just like to point out a clarification here. I hope that the Act uses the wide term of the definition of officer, because in the armed services, the term officer actually means something different than it does in the customs service or an MPIA. In the armed services, officer actually means someone who has been commissioned and completed officer training. I think this should actually read, Mr Chair, every member in command of any vessel, aircraft or unit of the New Zealand Defence Force, because what we may find is there are people who are actually non-commissioned officers who are in charge of vessels, aircraft or unit of the Defence Force that under this Act actually will not have those arresting powers, and I think that will perhaps be an unintended consequence. Mr Speaker, one thing that I would like to point out here is I suspect, knowing what's gone on in the past, that some of these cases will end up in court. And I do know, in absence of any solid information, what judges may do is they may look at Hansard debates to see the intent of Parliament. There are a couple of clauses here that talk about reasonable in the circumstance, and what they normally talk, well, in section 39B1, it requires a person, for example, to stop and remain stopped for a period that is no longer than is reasonable in the circumstance. In 39E part 3, it talks about if the arresting officer is not a constable, the arresting officer must deliver the arrested person into the custody of the constable as soon as it is reasonably practical. Now, what I would like to highlight here, sir, is that I hope if these do appear before the court, that the judge takes into account the definition of reasonable circumstance in the situation within which an arrest has occurred. For example, we're not talking about an offender who has been caught on Ponsonby Road and there's a reasonable expectation an officer will turn up in 10, 15 or 20 minutes. We may be talking about a circumstance where an arresting officer has made an arrest in a situation where it is unreasonable to expect an officer of the law to turn up in a time any less than an hour or even 2 hours. So what we absolutely need to ensure, I believe, is that every case that is prosecuted, it takes that reasonable or practical time in the circumstance within which the arrest was made. There's just one other point I would like to make, Mr Chair, and that is 39E2. Again, it talks about, and I quote, at the time of arrest, the arresting officer must, unless it is impractical to do so, Part B, produce evidence. Now, I can envisage a number of circumstances where an arresting officer, as defined under this Act, simply has not got any identifying or any identification on them that will prove to the person who's making an arrest that they are a fisheries officer, that they're a ranger, or they're a member of the New Zealand Defence Force. So again, I hope this is taken in the context within which the Act means, which actually is, you know, we've got to deliver a level of pragmatism around this. We're talking about a situation when often people are out and about in the wilderness, out on the beaches, in the rivers, and therefore the expectation around what the arresting officer will have on them at the time of the arrest, or when an officer can turn up, or when they can deliver that person to a constable, is a lot different than in many other circumstances. And I'll leave it at. But one thing I would say is I agree with everyone. Fantastic piece of legislation. We absolutely need to tighten up what we can do and who should be able to arrest people who seek to take advantage of our wildlife. So congratulations, Minister.